All right, so learning objective 2, we're just going to look at a few basic characteristics of business cycles. So what types of things would define an expansion? What types of things would define a recession? And so we're going to use several key variables that are of interest to us and look at how they change in expansions and recessions. So C is our consumption. So if I kind of make a little table here, and I'll look at expansion and recession. Okay, so, whoops, sorry, I've got to move these up a little bit. This is expansion, and this is recession. And so I want to know, how does consumption change in expansion and recession? And just what you would expect, right? In an economic boom, consumption is going to increase. Our real GDP is going up. That's the definition of an expansion. And when our real GDP goes up, our income goes up, and therefore we're going to consume more. So in an expansion, consumption is increasing, while in a recession, consumption is going to tend to decrease. Now, investment, that is the I, that's investment spending by companies. That's not our investment as consumers thinking of saving in the stock market. We mean companies buying physical machines, buildings, etc., capital. Again, that is going to move in the same direction as real GDP. So in an expansion or a boom, firms are going to increase investment spending. The economy is doing well. I want to buy more equipment and buildings and machines for my company to produce more in the future. In a recession, it's the opposite effect. Y is our real GDP. And obviously that's increasing in an expansion, decreasing in a recession. Employment is E. That also moves with real GDP. So in an expansion, real GDP goes up. That happens basically because employment is increasing. In a recession, employment is going to decrease. Now U is our unemployment, and that goes in the other direction. So in an expansion, unemployment is going to decrease. So we saw that unemployment rate from 2010 until 2020 was decreasing because we had an expansion for that period of time. And in a recession, the unemployment rate is going to increase. So those are some key variables that we look at and how they move over the business cycle. And so we're going to then try to understand what it is that drives these changes in these variables. Now, one other part of business cycles that's important to consider is what I call volatility. So what is volatility is really sort of how much around the trend it actually moves. So how much around the trend a variable moves. So if you've had statistics, this would be somewhat similar to the idea of variance. So if I was to draw one variable here, so if this was time, and this is my variable, I'll call it y, noting that that doesn't necessarily have to be our real GDP or income. It's some variable y. And so if this is my trend, a variable that's not particularly volatile will have very small movements around the trend, right? The movements are there. They're just not very big. If I measured the distance between peak to the trend, it would be relatively small. Right there, you can barely see it. So not volatile versus a variable that is very volatile. Here's my trend. I have very big movements around the trend. So the distance from peak or trough to trend is relatively large. And so that would be more volatile. And so when I think about business cycles, what we're really interested in is how volatile our variables are, right? So we may have a business cycle, but if our changes in real GDP looked like this graph, where it wasn't very volatile, we might not even care that much about real GDP. When I showed that picture of the unemployment rate, it looked a lot more volatile. It was moving up and down in big swings. And so what macro variables are the most volatile? Hands down is investment. So investment looks much like that graph there. So investment is subject to very large swings up and down in real GDP. Over time in investment relative to real GDP. And so that is by far the most volatile variable. Second to that would be real GDP itself. And then from there, consumption and employment are a little bit less volatile than real GDP, and certainly much less so than investment. So the reason I bring this up is that if I want to understand business cycles, the variable that seems to move the most in business cycles from a macro perspective is investment. So if I want to understand those changes in the unemployment rate, it seems like I need to understand what's going on with investment. And that is certainly something that we are going to look at coming up here. So related to these parts, I've got a few questions on Canvas for Learning Objective 1 and 2 that will kind of help you review some of this stuff and get you ready for the homework problems on these, which will then in themselves get you ready for exam questions on these problems. So have a look at these, try them on your own first, please, and then have a look at the solution. And if you're still not sure, rewatch the video, try it again, and if you have questions, then certainly let me know.